I want to dive into the treacherous waters of the Tucker Carlson, Ben Shapiro, and Nick Fuentes debate that is raging on the right now. I think this is a pretty significant issue that has the potential to completely change the trajectory of US politics, particularly as it relates for conservatives and frankly our two-party system. But I think it has the capacity to really change things moving forward. And you're probably wondering, okay, well, you don't really talk about foreign policy on this channel. Why are you diving into this, Amanda? And it's because of this document right here, which I will link in the description below. So before I started doing all of this, I had a previous life working as a defense contractor in Washington, D.C., and my area of specialties was Middle East security. Specifically in college, I focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and this right here is my senior thesis. I wrote it concerning the future for a Palestinian state, specifically in the West Bank, and analyzed the institutional capacity of West Bank authorities to be able to provide the services and functions of a state. So could it provide its own security? Could it collect taxes, manage a police force, all that kind of stuff? And so this was my senior thesis. This is what I wrote about. And so I have quite a bit of knowledge on the topic, and I've also traveled extensively to the region. I've been to Israel several times, and I also lived in Jordan. So I wanted to wade in and offer my 2 cents because I have a perspective that not a lot of Americans have, and I don't have skin in the game, right? Like I'm not an Arab, I'm not a Jew, I'm not a Muslim, I'm not a Jew. So I can offer a relatively neutral, unbiased, objective opinion about this, right? Because I just, I have no equity in the outcomes of the conflict over there. But I do think, and because I've seen this throughout my own, the start of my career when I was doing this kind of stuff, I've seen how pervasive this issue is in politics. And I think for the longest time, it kind of was just accepted as it is. Like AIPAC which AIPAC, if you're not familiar, is the Israeli political lobby in Washington that funds a lot of U.S. elections, particularly in favor of conservatives. It just kind of, it is what is. It was all kind of accepted. And I think in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination, and now with the emergence of Nick Fuentes as the leader or the de facto leader of, I would say, Gen Z, politically speaking, I think things are, the tide is starting to turn. And I think we need to talk about this because this is going to become a decisive turning point for U.S. politics moving forward. So like I said, I'll link this if you want to read it. You don't have to if you don't want to, but it's there for your taking. So to start, I kind of want to frame this around how the issue of Israel and Palestine is affecting U.S. politics. And so just to start, you can think of U.S. politics on a spectrum, right? So you have Democrats on the left, Republicans on the right, and you have your independents and moderates in the middle. And I'd say probably up until the beginning of wokeism, people either skewed Democrat or Republican. And there was a very small minority of people that were, not minority, but there was a small number of people who were independents. But people, pretty much picked one side, okay? But then with the emergence of woke on the left, you saw the introduction of a purity test or a litmus test that was effectively being used to weed out moderates in the Democratic Party. So things like man equals woman, you had to agree to that. White privilege became part of the litmus test. Stolen land and the relationship that premise has with immigration. These are all, core principles of the left-wing, leftist, de facto Democratic Party now that you have to ascribe to. So what happens if you don't pass the purity test? Well, if you're like me and you think a man does not equal a woman, you can't possibly be a Democrat because that is not a talking point I am willing to concede to. So that has pushed people to be more independent, more in the middle, right? What you might not be aware of is there's also a litmus test on the conservative side and within the conservative movement. And it just, again, it's been accepted. It hasn't really been talked about. But the litmus test is Israel. You're either pro-Israel or you're not. And if you're not pro-Israel, there are serious consequences of that. And to see the evidence of this, I would say look no further than the fallout, again, of Ben Shapiro, Tucker Carlson, Nick Fuentes and some implications that are being made with regard to Charlie Kirk's assassination. I mean, Tucker Carlson right now is being attempted to be canceled by conservatives in real time. And a lot of this stems from the belief that he is anti-Semitic because he hosted Daryl Cooper, of all people, on his podcast. I think it was earlier this year. But Daryl Cooper made some comments that were taken out of context. He was simply questioning the historical narrative we've all been told about World War II, questioning it, offering his alternative, interpretation of events, and that automatically got him cast as an anti-Semite. So because Tucker Carlson gave a platform and interviewed Daryl Cooper, therefore Tucker Carlson is now an anti-Semite. Well, he didn't really help himself because he also recently interviewed Nick Fuentes. I'm going to be straight up and honest with you. I don't know much about Nick Fuentes. I don't consume his content regularly. I did watch the interview with Tucker Carlson. I pretty much agreed with him on most of what he said. There was nothing particularly repugnant or anti-Semitic or offensive that he said. I think his position made a lot of sense to me and something I could relate with, and I can see why a lot of other people relate with him as well. But again, I haven't seen any of his other content. It's not something I consume. And given the precedent that's been set, both with the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination on the left, but also how Daryl Cooper was taken out of context, I'm gonna be honest, I don't really trust the people who are pulling clips of things that Nick Fuentes has said and are being okay, here's proof he's an anti-Semite. Because it's clear conservatives are just as capable of pulling things out of context and misattributing information just as much as folks on the left. So I don't fully trust all of the information that is being told. So if Ben Shapiro and Megyn Kelly say that he's an anti-Semite because they pull a clip of Nick Fuentes playing Grand Theft Auto, that's not a selling point for me to buy that argument, okay? It would require a much deeper dive. But there's clearly an issue now with Tucker Carlson being anti-Semitic because he has platformed now two individuals who the right considers to be anti-Semitic. And of course, Nick Fuentes is at the top of this. And this largely, from my interpretation of the Tucker Carlson interview, it stems from some tweets that Nick Fuentes had with Ben Shapiro back when Nick Fuentes was in college at Boston University. And he said, based on what he said, his position seems pretty acceptable in my opinion. If you support America, then you're America first. If you support Israel, then you have dual allegiances and you can't possibly be, America first. So someone like Ben Shapiro, who talks openly about foreign policy, this is part of his own platform, and he's very pro-Israel. There is a competition in where his loyalties lie, and that in and of itself is considered by some people to be an anti-Semitic position. And I'm just gonna throw my 2 cents out there, but my belief personally, just having traveled to Israel, been there, experienced things, which I'll share some of my own experiences and stories in a minute. But based on my experience, my observations, I think the pro-Israel position held by American Jews is a luxury belief. These people, many of them, do not hold Israeli citizenship. They have no intention of holding Israeli citizenship, something that by their nature of their birthright, that's why Israel has its birthright program, they are allowed to perform what is called aliyah, and they are allowed to receive Israeli citizenship. So at any point in time, someone like Ben Shapiro can obtain Israeli citizenship, be an Israeli citizen, be a dual citizen, an Israeli American citizen, and have adequate representation and equity in both countries. But the fact that American Jews like Ben Shapiro don't have dual citizenship and haven't established equity in the outcomes of the state of Israel, I have problems with that. I think that is a luxury belief because these people are able to sit here in the comfort of their own home here in the United States. They don't have to worry about being terrorized, being attacked. They're not going to have sirens going off all the time. They're not going to have to worry about missiles coming in. They're not going to have to live the same siege mentality mindset that people in Israel live. And I'll tell you, just having spoken to Israelis, interacted with them, they don't like American Jews, okay? They don't like American Jews because they recognize that each constituency, even though they share the same ethnicity and many share the same religious practices, they come from very different worldviews and very different positions. Those in Israel are on the front lines of the national security crisis that is facing them and the existential crisis facing their country, right? They are the ones who are serving in the IDF because they are conscripted to. They are the ones who are constantly going through security checkpoints and living through that on a day-to-day basis. Like, just to give you a small example, but you can't go to like a shopping mall or like a bus station in Israel without having to go through some sort of security. And it can vary from place to place. Some it's just like a metal detector. Some you might have a full body frisk. But as a comparison, here in the United States, you can go to Union Station in Washington, D.C. There's shopping there. There's restaurants. There's Amtrak train terminals. There's no security. Like, you can walk into Union Station and do Lord knows who what. Just do whatever you want. No security. And so that's the comparison, is every single day, Israelis are reminded of the existential threat that faces them by nature of the neighborhood they live in the Middle East. That same existential threat does not face, it's not the same threat that American Jews face here. And I think a lot of Israelis feel, especially younger and more liberal Israelis, feel like American Jews appropriate the cause of Israel for their own benefit, their own gain, especially politically speaking, and they have no experience, no equity in the struggle of living over there. And because they haven't performed Aliyah and gotten their citizenship, like, they have no intention of ever becoming Israelis, right? So there's an important distinction between how, American Jews perceive Israel versus how Israeli citizens, not even just Jews, Israeli citizens, perceive Israel. So when someone like Nick Fuentes makes that statement and says, like, okay, well, Ben Shapiro isn't America First because he puts Israeli policy ahead of America and says that Israeli policy is American policy, I tend to agree with that because, like I said, Ben Shapiro, other than being a Jew and establishing a personal affinity for the state of Israel, to my knowledge, has not actually established any sort of real equity in the state of Israel itself. He's not a citizen. I don't know if he owns a home there. I don't know if he owns property there. I don't know if he owns businesses there or has interests there. But to my knowledge, he doesn't. So if someone has other information, like, please share that with me. Editing Amanda here. I wanted to fact check myself on this just to give you greater context about the claim I made with Ben Shapiro not having Israeli citizenship or, in my opinion, sufficient equity in Israel. So this is a publication that covers Israel and just the Jewish diaspora in general. And it's from 2022, and it talks about an event that Ben Shapiro was at in Tel Aviv back in 2022. And the question came up during an interview session that asked if Ben Shapiro, would ever consider fulfilling Aliyah and moving to Israel and becoming an Israeli citizen. And he said, he said the fundamental principles of the United States are good, eternally good and worth upholding. And my fight to do that as a Jew is deeply important, not just to the people who are not Jews, but particularly to Jews. So he says, my Jewish mission does not conflict with my presence in the United States or my citizenship in the United States or my loyalty to the United States. I personally think that is a cop-out. Like, if you are going to hold such a high moral authority on all things that have to do with Israel, but you're not also willing to have dual citizenship with the country, like, this just, again, it feels like a very privileged position that he can say this from the comfort of being an American citizen, being in America, not having to deal with the stuff that Israelis have to deal with that on a daily basis. And you can kind of see it in the body language of the interviewer. So I'm going to play this short clip real quick where he gives his response in more detail. But just watch the interviewer on the left. This is an Israeli, and he kind of gives you some vibes and some body language that, okay, buddy, like, you can get citizenship if you really care this much about Israel.
Because
you can take the night to think about it, by the way.
Because the fundamental principles of the United States are good, eternally good, and worth upholding. And my fight to do that as a Jew is deeply important, not just to people who are not Jewish, but particularly to Jews. So in other words, my Jewish mission does not conflict with my presence in the United States or my citizenship in the United States or my loyalty to the United States.
Shouldn't Jews live in the state of Israel?
Shouldn't all Jews live in the state of Israel?
All the Jews.
Jews should live where they can do the most, where they can be a light to the nations. And for me, as a person with millions and millions of followers in the United States, promoting what I think are values that are truly good, living in the United States is a point of I think, morality for me.
Okay. Let's talk about the.
Yeah, so he didn't really like push him on this. I don't know who this the person moderating this is. I would have personally liked to see a little bit more pushback, but that's I think a relevant claim. You know, if Israel is supposed to be the homeland for the Jews, shouldn't all Jews like it shouldn't that be an obligation for all Jews to make an effort to become citizens of the country that has become like the national homeland for them? I think that's a relevant question. And obviously it was posed to Ben Shapiro. So as of 2022, based on this article, it does not look like Ben Shapiro has made Aliyah to Israel, does not hold Israeli citizenship, and like I said, has no real equity in the outcomes in the state of Israel, aside from the shared Jewish identity. So just wanted to offer that fact check for you guys. All right, back to the video. So I see that as a luxury belief. And then there's obviously this assumption that, you know, because Israel has been framed as a democracy in the Middle East, therefore it's equal to the United States and we share the same values. And that's not true. Israel is not a democracy, okay? Benjamin Netanyahu has been in power since 1996. He took like a decade off, but he has been running the state of Israel for as much time as Vladimir Putin has been running Russia. Okay, we don't look at Russia as a democracy. Why is Israel any different? Okay, so that's, you know, observation number one. Other than that, again, like having been there and traveled there and then lived in the region, I can tell you that Israel is a very hierarchical society. And just because on paper, you might have, you know, privileges in terms of voting and representation, doesn't mean that's actually implemented in practice. There's ethnic and religious divisions within Israeli society that has created a hierarchy where some citizens have more rights than others. And so from the ethnic perspective, Ashkenazi Jews, so Jews of European ancestry, tend to sit at the top of that hierarchy. They tend to have more rights than Middle East born Sephardic or Mizrahim Jews. And there's different socioeconomic opportunities, and things like that. And then, of course, aside from that, there are other minorities that live in the region. There are Arab Christians who live in the region, and there are Arab Muslims who are also citizens of the state of Israel. And they just don't have the same privileges and the same rights. They're not, you know, you're not going to see an Arab Israeli ascend to the highest ranks in the Knesset, which is like the equivalent of the Israeli parliament, or in you know, the prime minister's cabinet. Like, you're just not going to see that. And I know that to be true because I also lived in Jordan, and they kind of have a similar hierarchy there. So Jordan is quite a homogenous society. There are some minorities that live in Jordan, but one of the things that's interesting about Jordan is it used to, the West Bank of Israel versus Palestine, the West Bank used to be part of what was called Transjordan. And so they surrendered that. It's no longer part of Jordan, but there is a pretty substantial Palestinian population within Jordan. And then within like Jordanian society, the vast majority are Sunni Muslims, but then there's some ethnic minorities within that. So you have Arabs, you have Circassians, there's like subtle nuances, but Palestinians are not highly regarded in Jordanian society. Palestinians are not allowed to serve, to my knowledge, serve in the military and hold positions in the government. They're not really trusted, and some aren't really granted full citizenship. I think some have opted to become full Jordanian citizens, but the ones who want right of return, which is if there ever was a two-state solution, they would be able to return to their ancestral homeland. They have not obtained any sort of citizenship. So there are people living in the Palestinian diaspora across the Middle East who do not have full citizenship in the countries they inhabit. So Jordan is one example. And you often saw, at least this was my observation, you had a lot of Palestinians who were relegated to just basic like merchant roles, shopkeeping, again, like kind of like private sector-y stuff. They weren't allowed in government. And in the Middle East and in tribal areas, like having government positions conveys a lot of social capital, or what they refer to in the Middle East as wasta, like clout, right? Social capital and clout. So people want to have those positions. So if you're not allowed to work in those positions, you're kind of sequestered to a part of society where you're not going to succeed. And your kids aren't going to succeed. You're kind of like doomed from the start. So I'm not saying that's necessarily the equivalent in Israel, but the same type of ethos and mindset does exist, where you're going to see people at the bottom rung of Israeli society. So whether it's they're less religious, so maybe they're not ultra orthodox or conservative, maybe they're more liberal. People who are, like I said, Mizrahim or Sephardic, people who have Middle Eastern Jewish ancestry instead of European, or people who are not Jewish at all, they're Christian or Muslim, and they're just within Israel, they're there and they're citizens, but they're not fully part of or welcomed by the Israeli establishment and the society there. So I wouldn't say it's a democracy by any means. And there's other laws on the books too. Hate speech isn't permitted there. So here in the United States, we have the value of freedom of speech. There, they don't necessarily have that, okay? So they're not necessarily democracy, and they don't share our values. And this is just based on the history of Israel itself. When Israel, the state we know of Israel today, was originally founded by settlers in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, they came from Europe, right? And so the United States was founded in 1776. Like, Americans today, largely came from a Protestant Anglo-Saxon background. Of course, we're a melting pot, so you've had all sorts of immigrants come in and, shape the course of American society and how we interact with one another. But for the large part, like, the values, when we talk about American values, we're talking about Protestant Anglo-Saxon values, like the things that were enshrined in our Constitution right from the beginning, right from our founding, okay? And so what you have to realize is anyone who stayed in Europe after that point in time didn't have the same experience that the United States did. So while the United States, we had our revolution, we got our Constitution, and then we settled the rest of the West, and we built railroads, and we industrialized and all this kind of stuff. In Europe, they had the French Revolution, they had the Napoleonic Wars, they had the emergence of socialism, because industrialization just went kind of wild there. You had a lot of poverty, a huge wealth gap, so you had the rise of socialism, you had the revolutions in 1848, and then you had the breakout of World War I and the rise of nationalism and the emergence of new countries. So the history of Europe in the 1800s, very different than the history of the United States here, okay? And so the values that shaped the United States are not necessarily the values that everyone else in the world holds. So you can have a democratic form of government, sure, but you're not necessarily going to share the same values as the United States. So the original founders of what is today the state of Israel, these were the folks that came during the first, second, and third aliyahs, so waves of immigration. They came from Europe, okay? They came from Europe. They had a very different history than the history that Americans had when they came to the United States. And so because of that, the history of Israel is shaped in that image. So it's very different than ours, okay? So you can have respect for a country. You can have an affinity towards it. We can have some shared history, some shared background, right? They were European after all, so there is some shared background there. But for the most part, there isn't going to be a one-to-one transfer and equality between the values that America was founded on and the values that Israel was founded on. We're very, very different countries, very different religious traditions, very different, okay? So I think it's really disingenuous, actually, to say, America equals Israel, because we do have such distinct differences, and I think it's better to acknowledge the differences and respect them than try to conflate two countries as one and the same, because we're not, okay? So that's kind of how I see things based on my, observations and things, just having lived there and studied the culture, talk to people, all that kind of stuff, okay? So that's all that to say, to come back to this continuum here, is that there is an effective litmus test for conservatives on the right. You're either pro-Israel or you're not. And if you're not, which I am not, just by virtue of having published this document right here, I am not going to be accepted by any form of the conservative movement. So in case you all think I'm part of the conservative movement, I most certainly am not. If you're like me and you don't agree with the pro-Israel position, and I say that not in the sense of, I'm out here anti-Israel, I think Israel should be destroyed. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that I don't agree that Israel's interests are American interests, that Israel has the same values and the same interests as the United States. We can have relatively comparable values, right? Like US came out of the UK. We have a special bond with the UK, but our values are not always the same. We have very different, there's different things, right? Like they're still run by a monarchy. We're not, right? So there are distinctions, and I think it's beneficial to acknowledge the distinctions, right? So if you're not pro-Israel, if you're like me, you get pushed here, okay? So this leaves more and more independence, okay? So what has been happening as a result of these litmus tests is you're pushing people further and further to the extremes. So you have the purified Democrats over here who all believe in this stuff, and you have the purified Republicans who all believe in this stuff. And what you have here is this missing middle. You have politically homeless people who think both parties, frankly, suck. They're not helping any of us. We're all being bent over backwards every time we go to the grocery store. We're all struggling to make ends meet. I think there's a shared experience there between most people. We're watching the middle class disappear. Like at the end of the day, we don't care. Like the vast majority of people don't care about, whether or not America was stolen or whether or not, Israel has enough missiles to defend itself today. We care about, like, are we letting undocumented people into the country? Are they benefiting from our taxpayer-funded welfare programs? Do I have enough to take care of me and my family? Like, that's what people in the middle here, that's what they care about, okay? And so this is, I think, where Nick Fuentes is stepping up to fill the void. I think he represents young men. I think Charlie Kirk played that role, but in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination, a void has been created. So a new leader has emerged to represent the interests of Gen Z, and I think it is Nick Fuentes because his message of America First resonates. I think it resonates with a large swath of people. Like, you can disagree with some of his rhetoric, like his your body, my choice tweet, like, stupid, who cares? I know it pissed off a lot of women, but whatever. You can agree or disagree with that, fine. But the reality is he's pushing for, I would say, a more libertarian economic policy, a policy that says, okay, this is the United States. These are our values. This is our heritage. This is our culture. We want to preserve and protect this because we think that it's, under threat. We want to make sure that the American way of life can continue so that our children, our children's children can continue living in this country, that the American experiment does not fail. And these people think that issues like this and issues like this are not just trivial, but they're starting to interfere. With how Americans are able to live their lives. Like I said, if you're funding if you're funding illegal migrants through taxpayer-funded programs, and if you're funding weapon sales to Israel through also taxpayer-funded programs, the taxpayer is the one who's losing here, right? Like they're not benefiting out of it. They're getting squeezed. So I think what we're seeing now is a growing middle where neither the Democrats nor the Republicans appeal to, and you're seeing someone like Nick Fuentes who is filling the void. And obviously, this is problematic for folks on the right, as we're seeing with the not just the cancellation of Tucker Carlson, but also the financial punishment of people who don't agree with this, who don't check the Israeli box. And this has come out in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination. It's very clear that Charlie Kirk was being pushed by donors within Turning Point USA to push Tucker Carlson to the extreme, to not have him speak at events. And that stems from the belief that Tucker Carlson is an anti-Semite because he hosted Daryl Cooper and then most recently, Nick Fuentes. So just by association, right? Tucker Carlson is guilty by association. Therefore, Turning Point USA is also guilty by association. So this is how insidious, this is. you can't even just like, at least on the left, you can say, nah, I don't think a man is a woman and be called a transphobe. But here on the right, it's a web of first, second, and third degree anti-Semitism that people are just trying to be like, well, what is going on? Okay. So you saw the pressure, or at least they knew through the investigation into Charlie Kirk's assassination, information is coming to light that Charlie was pressured to kind of not sever ties, but keep a distance with Tucker Carlson. But it's also he had expressed his own changing opinion on the state of Israel based on what's happening in Gaza. Okay, so that clearly has happened. But then also others have come forward. I was watching a video Pearl posted yesterday about this because she waded into it, and I didn't know she had hosted Nick Fuentes. I don't consume too much of her content, but she had mentioned how she lost millions of dollars in sponsorships and ads and revenue because she hosted Nick Fuentes. So again, you're guilty by association. And so I think people on the right, not even just conservatives within the conservative movement, but folks on the right are starting to wake up and finally say something about it. Because for the longest time, you couldn't say anything about this. And I think the experience of Nick Fuentes is a great example. I mean, he says he was unbanked. I haven't confirmed that, so I'll take his word for it. But he also says he was put on a no-fly list, so he wasn't allowed to fly. He said in his interview with Tucker Carlson that he had to go to speaking engagements in Florida. He had to drive from Chicago to Florida because he wasn't allowed to board a flight. So, that happened to him. And then, of course, people are losing money and funding. So there's very clear pressure to bend to the will of the pro-Israel movement within the Republican and the conservative movement itself. And people are starting to push back on this. And so I think that is doing more harm to the conservatives. I think people like Ben Shapiro are going to do more harm to the conservative movement than good in the long run. And so you're going to just keep pushing people into the middle, and they're going to keep looking towards someone like Nick Fuentes as a source of inspiration. So if you like Nick Fuentes, this is a good thing for you. If you don't, if you think he's destructive to the United States, then this is definitely not a good thing. But I think young people in particular are starting to wake up to this and say, "No, we're good." And the young people are the future, right? So I think this is something definitely worth paying attention to because it is divisive. So I wanted to share my own experience with some of this because, like I said, I lived in the region, traveled to Israel extensively, and have my own experience, and that has shaped my opinion. So I'm not just pulling this out of my ass because I've read a few things or heard, Dave Smith talk about something, and it's okay, yeah, that sounds right. No, it's this is lived experience, right? So this is my own opinion based on things I've observed, witnessed, experienced, people I've talked to, on the ground. Okay, so take it or leave it. It's up to you. But I've been to Israel on 3 separate occasions. So the first time I went was in 2011. I went as part of a class. So my university offered a Maymaster 2-week course on Israeli security. The course was taught at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya at the Lauder School of Government. I think they've renamed or rebranded, so it's not called that anymore. But it was a 2-week course there. That was a funded course. So I want to fully disclose that there was, in much the same way that wealthy benefactors support, they're putting their name on buildings at universities, there was a couple that supported a program to fully fund this course. So anyone who went, you got free room or hotel stay, free flight, and the course itself was free. So as a poor student, I was would have been a sophomore at this time, sophomore, junior. I didn't have the ability to study abroad, so I was looking for whatever alternatives I could come up with to still get a kind of a broad experience without the full commitment of spending a semester abroad. This appealed to me. It was within my wheelhouse. I was studying Middle East security. It was free course credit, and it was a trip, right? So I took it. Other than that, there wasn't any sort of direct compensation, so you don't need to worry about that. So that was the first trip. And it definitely was I would say, curated trip. We weren't, we were not chaperoned, but guided on where to go. So I didn't go to the West Bank during that trip. Kind of stayed in Herzliya, and then we went to Tel Aviv and I think Jerusalem, and that was about it. The second trip I took was in the, end of 2012. And that was to write my senior thesis. I had been awarded funding to do research by my university, and that entailed me setting up meetings with all sorts of different people, academics, like university professors, political leaders, basically anyone who's willing to talk to me. I went and interviewed them and talked to them. And so that funding entailed my flight to Israel, reimbursement for stays at hostels. So I stayed at, like the Abraham Hostel, for example, if you've ever been. I love it. It's great. It's in Jerusalem. Stuff like that. So I stayed at a hostel, flew economy. And then I think I got reimbursed for like some of my meals, which entailed like eating falafel. Okay. So, at most, I think I got like $2,000 worth of compensation for that. And then the third trip, I was living in Jordan after I graduated. So this would have been 2013 to 2014. I was studying Arabic on a U.S. government-funded scholarship, and I was there between the fall and the spring semesters. And so we had I think a month off break, and there's not really much to do when class wasn't in session. So there was me, and there was one other student who was there for the full year, and then the program staff. And so me and one of the program staff members went to Israel for a couple of days. We went to Tel Aviv to go to a concert, like a jazz concert, and then came back through the West Bank. So on my second trip and my third trip, I went to the West Bank. The first two trips were funded, but not necessarily funded by the state of Israel. The last trip, I paid for myself, but I did want to disclose and share that because I know I put a post out asking if people would be interested in this, and some people raised comments about funding. And I know a lot of conservatives lately have been given basically North Korea style trips of seeing all the highlights and the wonderful things about Israel. And that's fine if they want to take those. I just want to share those 3 trips with you because I've already been, right? So there's no reason for me to get another funded trip to go. And I've seen how they do birthright, and it's a very curated experience. So rest assured, I'm not going to take money from the Israeli government. They don't care, hopefully, who I am. Don't know me. I'm just a small YouTube channel at this point. No one cares. And so I've already done this, right? So there's no reason to be concerned. But what I want to share with you today has to do with that second trip and then the third trip I took. And I think it's important because, like I said, we're told that we share values and that we have the same things. But I've traveled, I think, to 15 different countries at this point. Been in Latin America, Caribbean, and then in Europe. And the only country I have ever felt like my rights as a U.S. citizen were being violated, and where I felt like my safety was in question, was in Israel. That is the only place where I have experienced that. And I've, like I said, lived in Jordan. I couch surfed around Lebanon, traveled to all sorts of different places. Been to Turkey. The only country where I thought my rights were being threatened and then my inherent safety could also be threatened were in Israel. So on the second trip I took to Israel, like I said, I was doing research. I was interviewing people. And I was there for maybe a week or two, not even that long. And I got to the airport, was about to head back. I took a Turkish air flight, was flying through Istanbul, was on an outbound flight, leaving, not coming into the country, leaving. And my all my electronics and myself were detained, and I was brought to a back room by Israeli security forces. Another thing you have to keep in mind with Israel that makes it unique is that there's kind of a blend between the police and the IDF. They have overlapping jurisdictions, so you could be somewhere and like here in the United States, right? You'll see security guards places, but you won't see the National Guard. And obviously, because people are freaking out about that right now with Trump threatening to send the National Guard into cities like Chicago and Portland, you're not gonna see the National Guard running around, right? You're gonna see security, local police, private security guards, and then no one ever really sees the National Guard. Israel, that's not the case. You see the IDF everywhere. They're interspersed throughout the society. If you are in the IDF and you are conscripted, you have to carry your weapon and be in uniform at all times. So it's not uncommon to go to a shopping mall or go to the airport and have IDF soldiers around. So I was detained by Israeli security, didn't really know who they were affiliated with. Could have been like the Ben Gurion airport security, could have been IDF, could have been Mossad. Like I had no idea who they were. They didn't disclose who they were. They took me to a back room. They took all of my possessions from me. So they took my bag, like I said, all my electronics. So at the time, I think I had a BlackBerry, I had a Kindle Fire, and I had my Dell laptop. And so they took all that. They separated me from my electronics. So they took, and my bag. So they took all my possessions into one room behind a closed door, didn't see where they went. And then they had me in another. They completely strip searched me. And I mean like full body strip search. And again, been to lots of places, gone through lots of airport security before, never experienced anything like that. I wouldn't say they interrogated me, but they started asking me a lot of like pressing questions about why I was in the country, what I was doing. They were interested in like the research I was doing. They wanted to see my notes, all that kind of stuff. It was very bizarre, right? Like I'm a 21-year-old college student at this point. Like what is possibly threatening, about me at the time, 2011 or 2012, like Israel wasn't in a state of war. Like the second intifada had ended at this point. So it wasn't like there was an acute threat to their well-being. They were kind of in an interlude. So I was really confused. I was like, what is going on? What is happening? And so they were asking me all these questions, didn't tell me why I was being detained, didn't tell me what I was doing. And this whole time I'm wondering, okay, like, am I going to miss my flight? Am I not going to be allowed to leave the country? And so the whole experience was really unsettling to me. So one of the big issues I had, and I even called the FBI, to be honest, I called the FBI when I got back because I was really concerned about this, was that I had some technological issues while I was there on this trip. So I had my laptop had broken, and again, I'm a poor college student, right? Like crappy Dell laptop, a couple of my keys on my keyboard were missing. It wasn't a really good laptop, but it had died, like as I was going to Israel. So I didn't have a way to like check in with email or like type up notes. The only device I had that could really do that was my Kindle Fire. So I had decided, and if you don't know what Kindle Fire is, it's just a Kindle e-reader, but I had the first edition one. So it was like the one that connected to the internet. And so you could access like email and stuff. And so I decided, just because I was traveling and that's the only source of connection I had to the outside world, I unlocked it. So I removed the security passcode. So I don't know what they did with that device. I don't know if they went through all the books I had on there. Like I said, I was studying like Middle East security. So I had all sorts of, textbooks, like the textbooks I could get, I did get for Kindle. So I had all sorts of books on there, some class notes, like PDFs that we would have to read for class, like that kind of stuff. But then this was also during a time where the Israelis have been known to download malware and stuff onto devices. I mean, Stuxnet with the Iranian nuclear facilities, like that's a great example. So I didn't even know, like, did they download something? Did they put like some sort of software on it? Like, I have no idea. To this day, I have no idea what they did. But I called the FBI field office when I got back, and I reported what happened. I was like, hey, this isn't normal. This is weird. What should I do? Radio silence. They didn't care. But I share all that because it was deeply unsettling to me. Like, I had never been through that experience before, where I was detained upon leaving a country and all my possessions were taken to another room, and I had no idea what was happening. But it was also unsettling because you have to think of this as a context of someone who is an American, right? So America spends billions of dollars every year funding the security of the Israeli state, the state of Israel. We provide military security, weapons, all that kind of stuff. And so I, as a taxpayer, when I go to a country like that is a recipient of the generosity of American taxpayers, you expect like a modicum of respect and dignity, right? Like you expect someone who's your friend, who's your ally, you expect some degree of respect, right? You don't expect to be detained. You don't expect to like have a body search. You don't expect to have your possessions taken. And so it was unsettling to me because it's like, okay, I'm here and this is a country that's supposed to be friendly to the United States. And here they are like violating my Fourth Amendment rights. And it's like, yeah, I get like in other countries, like your rights don't necessarily translate. Like there isn't necessarily like freedom of speech, for example, in like the UK right now. So it's not always like an equal transfer. But when you're 20 something traveling, you're just focused on your schoolwork, and this happens, you're just like, wow, okay, this is really weird. This is not how like countries are supposed to act. But then again, Israel has always been given a pass, right? Because it is besieged by, it's Muslim Arab neighbors that are hell-bent on destroying it. And that's the narrative. The narrative is Israel is facing existential threat and there are always people out to destroy it. And so because of that, I think some of this behavior has been given a pass. And so it's just been accepted, okay, well, Israel's going to treat people like this. And I don't think it's respectable, and I don't think it's okay that as a taxpayer, like that's how American citizens are treated in another country. And before going on that trip, I did read up because I was concerned just based on where I was going and what I was doing. And there are other stories of people who have experienced similar things. So there are anecdotes of people, particularly American Muslims or Americans of Arab ancestry, who you'll arrive at Ben Gurion Airport and they'll want to go through your Gmail, they'll want to go through your social media accounts, and they'll want to like evaluate you. And that's very invasive, and that's not an American value at all. We value freedom and freedom from state searches and seizures, and there are issues we have here. Not going to deny that, but like that is a freedom that we hold dear. So for an ally to do that to you, it's like, okay, like what else are they doing? So the other experience I had was during that third trip. So that was, again, the semester break between 2013 to 2014. We had gone to the West Bank. My traveler, my companion I was traveling with, she had won like a guitar. So we had to haul, and like some raffles. So we had to haul a guitar around with us. It was crazy. But we were just there, going to a concert, passing through the West Bank. So I want to share a map with you because I think this will make it a little bit easier to understand what I'm talking about. So we lived here. I lived in Irbid up in northern Jordan. And so to get to Israel, you typically go through Amman, and there's a border crossing somewhere here, and then you go into Jerusalem. So that's what we did on the way in. And then we went to Tel Aviv, and then we came back to Jerusalem, and we went through Ramallah and Nablus, and we came all the way up here to Jenin before heading back. And so that was our plan. Our plan was to kind of come down, go across, come back, and then do kind of a loop-de-loop. It's just, you look at the map, right? Makes sense. So we hired a taxi. The taxi driver took us, I think, from Nablus to Jenin. Jenin was the closest border crossing. We wanted to go to Nazareth, where we could catch a bus to get to the King Hussein border crossing here, and then take a cab to our apartments back in Irbid. So we got to the Jenin border crossing. You can see the dotted line here. This is the border. So this is the West Bank. And so Israel treats the West Bank as a militarized zone. So there are pockets, very small pockets of the West Bank where it's fully controlled by the Palestinians, but for the most part, it's under Israeli occupation. So that means there are Israeli military outposts. There are also the settlements, which you've probably heard of. Some of those I think are protected by the Israeli government and the Israeli Defense Forces. Some I don't think are. I think they're kind of on their own. And so you have a combination of people just randomly living there, but then also state-sanctioned Israeli or military forces that have set up bases effectively within the country. And because it's a military zone, they're allowed to do whatever they want. So there is no real rule of law. So if they think you look like someone who threw a stone, or if they think like your cousin did something or whatever, like they can the Israeli security forces there can just round you up, take you to a prison, and lock you up. And there's no court proceedings. You see this all the time. And this is why people are being radicalized and why Palestinians hate the Israeli government so much, is because this happens all the time. People are picked up, they're rounded up, they're sent to prison. They have no idea why. This happens when you're 13, 14 years old. You're just a boy. You don't know what's going on. And this has been happening for generations at this point. So this is why people are fed up. Like you constantly live under an occupation where you don't have freedom of movement. You can't just work whatever job you want to work. You can't provide for your family. It's really not, it's not a good living situation at all. I've met some wonderful people there who are very pleasant, but it's not a good living situation. So anyways, we got to Jenin, and On that day, for whatever reason, unbeknownst to us, the Israelis managing the border and the border security outpost that day decided to just close it to pedestrians. So usually the border will have a vehicle area and then a pedestrian area. And this is because if you have a Palestinian license plate, you cannot drive into Israel. So let's say you work in a border town here, right? Let's say there's a factory here on the border and you live in Jenin and you got to come here and work in a factory on the Israeli side. Every single day you have to drive to the border and then walk across the border. So this is and like I said, this is a daily occurrence for these people. So if the Israelis decide, okay, that we're gonna close the border today, like you don't go to work, and if you don't go to work, you lose your job. It really creates a lot of strife for people who just want to do what we talk about here in the United States of living the American dream. They just want to provide for their kids, provide for their wife, go to work, come home, repeat. That's all they want to do. Like they're not necessarily politically active, but the fact that life has gotten so difficult has made them more politically active, as we're seeing in the United States right now. Okay, so this is how a lot of this is related. And so we got to the border crossing, and the Israelis had just decided to close it. So the cab driver dropped us off, and there was another woman who was standing on the side of the road, a Swedish woman who, I think she ran some sort of like after school kids program, some sort of like pup fit programs, but she lived in Israel and she came to Jenin like once or twice a week to run her program. And so I don't know how long she had been waiting on the side of the road. I just know she had been waiting for some time and she was not happy about it. So you had 2 Americans and a Swede standing outside of the border crossing at Jenin, waiting for the miraculous hope that someone would cross the border from the Palestinian side into Israel with an Israeli license plate, because the only way we could cross is in a vehicle, because that was the only part of the border that was open. I think we waited maybe an hour, and this was the middle of the day too. Like it wasn't like, it was hot. It was, you're in the sun, it's open, it's, arid, right? So not a lot of shade. So we were in the sun kind of waiting. Didn't know what was going to happen. I think we waited for like an hour, and then a guy pulled up in a sedan with Israeli tags, and he let us get in his car. And it was really gracious of him to do that because, of course, we got flagged to be checked at the security checkpoint. So even though he was an Israeli citizen with an Israeli, tag, license plate, because he had a Swede and 2 Americans in his car with him, he got flagged for an extra security check. And so even though, like, I talk about the siege mindset, and even though, like, Israelis do feel under threat, they do this to their own, too. It's not even just, like, they harass Palestinians. Like, they're harassing other Israelis, too. Like, they're making life miserable for everyone there, not just the Palestinians. So there's people with Israelis who, like, are sick of this and tired of it, too. And so we had to be, we were stopped and had to go through the checkpoint. So it was kind of like an airport style checkpoint. We had to take all of our bags out. You had to go like put them through an x-ray. You had to do like the full body scan. They asked us where we were going, what we were doing, all that kind of stuff. And so, it probably took about an hour to get through that. So we added an extra hour to this guy's day. And I was really grateful. He ended up dropping us off in Nazareth, which was where we wanted to go. And then we were able to take the bus from Nazareth to the King Hussein crossing. And that was actually a really peaceful bus ride. I remember that. That was, nice. It was just like, okay, end of the trip, done. It was very peaceful. But the whole like experience, effectively having to hitchhike across quasi-international border was again like deeply unsettling, but the experience really stuck with me because, like I said, it's something that these people experience on a day-to-day basis. So obviously the Palestinians experience it, but also the Israelis. And I remember like we were talking with the guy because it was a short ride to Nazareth, so we had some time to chat with him. And he talked about like he's like, yeah, I'm trying to move to Spain. Like I want to get out of here. I really hate it. I'm tired of living here. So I hope he got to go to Spain. But this was the sentiment I got from a lot of younger millennial Israelis, that they were tired of living like caged animals who are constantly under threat. And a lot of times too, it's not even just like there's an actual threat. It's politically expedient for the Netanyahu government, because that's who's been in charge this whole time. It really is politically expedient for them to highlight the threat in much the same way you can compare that to the post 9/11 period here in the United States, where, everyone, especially neocons, were like, oh, Arabs, Muslims are doing this, they're doing that, right? it fed into the narrative, and it boosted their political points. So that's what they kept doing. They kept feeding into this whole like, well, there could be another bomber, there could be this, there could be that, and it just created an unpleasant environment for people living there. But I want to just show you, because Israel is small and it's hard to defend, right? Like from Netanya to here, like you don't really have that much of a border to work with, and so one of the things that is really important to know is if you are a Palestinian living in Ramallah, let's say you have stage 3 cancer, right? You can't just drive across here to Tel Aviv. It's probably like an hour, maybe. You can't just drive from Ramallah to Tel Aviv. You have to get permission. You have to make sure the border crossings are open, right? Like you have to make sure all your ducks in a row just to go to chemotherapy treatment. And why is that a big deal? Because again, America is funding the state of Israel. We're providing for the security. We are the ones, our taxpaying dollars are funding the security of the state for it to exist. Tel Aviv, Israel has like one of the top medical establishments in the world. They have really phenomenal medical care. Like Tel Aviv's a nice city. Like they have a lot of resources, right? And so the fact that we're funding this with our tax dollars, and someone's like grandma in Ramallah can't just get in a car and go to Tel Aviv and get cancer treatments. Like this is what we're talking about, right? Like effectively they've turned the West Bank, and now as you're seeing with Gaza, in the Gaza Strip, far worse what's happening in Gaza right now. But they've effectively turned the Palestinian territories into open air internment camps where the Israeli government controls who comes in, who goes out, and therefore what kind of economy can develop there, and the life that people have to live. And the West Bank, it's gotten pretty tense because you have a lot of settlements, many of which are illegal, not sanctioned, but just popping up anyways, that are taking people's land. And this has been going on for quite a while now. And so I think people are fed up. I think folks on the left are obviously on the pro-Palestine side. I think personally they've taken things a little too far. They don't actually know, like they're not willing to learn. They don't actually know the history, and they're just like pushing talking points that again align with the purity test on the left. But folks on the right, I think, have some knowledge, have some experience, maybe that they do have Jewish ancestry. They have been to the region, they have visited, and yet they still support this kind of stuff, and they support U.S. taxpayer-funded dollars going and just making life miserable for people living there. And then, of course, violating their rights. Like there is nothing democratic about having a military occupation to harass people that you disagree with. Like that, there's nothing democratic about that. I don't see anything democratic with Benjamin Netanyahu's reign as prime minister in Israel. There's nothing democratic about that. So I wanted to share these stories because again, like I've traveled, and I think this is really translating into U.S. politics right now, because you have to either side with the pro-Israel camp or you don't. And if you don't, you're an enemy of the conservative movement. And so I think, like I said, this is pushing people into the middle. It's pushing people not even just to the middle in terms of a moderate position, but it's disenfranchising people on both sides. So you no longer have just Democrats or Republicans. You have a large swath of people who are independent in the middle. And now they are looking for alternatives. And I think Nick Fuentes is positioning himself as an alternative. And I think that's why we're seeing what's happening, the civil war we're seeing happening right now. It's because I think they understand there's a threat, and that the conservative movement as it currently exists, as a pro-Israel, Israeli interests equal American interests, so long as that continues to exist, I don't think they're going to be able to continue wooing voters, especially young male voters. I think people who are tired of this are, they're opting out. And again, I'm speaking from experience, but this was like my whole thing. And then I remember I was on a work trip in Amman in I think it was 2017. That's kind of when I had my like awakening moment, my little epiphany. I remember going through, I was sitting in the car, that was taking us back to the hotel, and I was just sitting there thinking, like, what am I doing here? Like, there's so many problems in the United States, right? Trump had just been elected. So things were obviously changing in the United States, but economically speaking, you have all sorts of problems here, right? Hunger, as we're seeing now with SNAP, but homeless veterans, economic decline, and a lot of small town America. Like, there's just so many issues here, and it really dawned on me, like, I'm a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant from upstate New York. What am I doing in the Middle East? I have no equity here, no stake, no skin in the game, no interest, frankly, no interest. I was trying for so long to like make the case for why I needed to be like this Middle East security expert, and I could never do it. And so I was, I remember on that trip, I was like, all right, I'm done. And then I left. I stopped doing this work. I stopped caring. I stopped paying attention, because this has no bearing on the United States. This has no bearing on my life here in America. It has no bearing on your life. This is half a world away. These are issues that have nothing to do with us. They have a history that is totally different than our history. I think we can respect other countries as much as, we do with any other country. But the special relationship that exists between Israel and the United States, it's just, I think it's on sand. It's built on sand. There's nothing there. And it's becoming increasingly difficult to convince Americans who, again, have no equity, no stake, no background in this, to like continue taking skin in the game, continue investing taxpayer dollars into outcomes that don't have an effect on them. And then, I echo Tucker Carlson's position. Like, the only thing I think most of us can resonate with is the effect this is having on Christian and minority groups in the Middle East. The Middle East is predominantly Muslim, and then, of course, Israel is largely Jewish. But there are lots of Christians who have been caught in the middle. Again, they have there's no feud here. If you're looking for some ancestral blood feud, like, there's no feud. They're just people trying to live their lives. And, you're seeing the persecution of those groups of people in the Middle East. And I'll just say, again, like, having lived there are two groups of people where I experienced the most generous hospitality from. I'm not saying that if I didn't experience really good hospitality, that people were bad. I'm just saying there are two groups of people that really stood out to me as providing the most hospitality and being the most hospitable people when I traveled there. The first group were typically Western educated individuals who may have been born into Muslim families, but were not practicing Muslims themselves. The other group were Christians. I got to a couple of my classmates at the University of Saida in Irbid, where Christians, got to go to some, church services with them and do some things with them. And it just, that always stuck with me, that the people that I experienced the most kindness and generosity from, never felt animus from, never felt threatened by, were Arab Christians, and I would say like secular, Western educated, non-religious, the non-religious Muslims. And so that stood out to me. And that's both in Jordan and in Israel and the West, Israel and the West Bank as well. So I'll leave you with that. Again, this is my experience. I'm just sharing this because I have these stories to share, and I can add perspective, and hopefully it's objective and unbiased and kind of frames things a little bit differently, so you can see how this is impacting U.S. politics. It's not just about foreign policy, but how foreign policy shapes U.S. politics and how that impacts you and I. Like, we just, I think I'm with Rand Paul on this one. Like, you can't just keep funding endless wars in the Middle East. You can't keep just sending taxpayer dollars overseas to finance, be the police force of the world. We can't do this anymore. There's a breaking point. We've reached it. We need to take care of people in the United States. And I think that is why Nick Fuentes is appealing to people. So, like him or not, I think that's where we're heading. And like I said, you can leave my opinion or take it. But again, this is based on lived experience, sharing what I witnessed and observed. So it is what it is. If you appreciate this video and this commentary, I'd love it if you'd like and subscribe. If you didn't and you disagree with me, that's fine. Just, don't go into the comments and, don't actually put like anti-Semitic stuff in the comments. Like, not here for that. Like, Charlie Kirk said, when we stop talking, that's when violence happens. Right. And so I think this is important to talk about. I think this is an important conversation to have. And I'm tired of the folks on the left calling all of us racist and transphobe misogynists because we disagree with them. And I think if you call someone a Nazi, you call someone a Nazi or an anti-Semite on the right, you're doing the same thing. Like, you're no different than those on the left. So We need to either have constructive discourse or acknowledge that the left has, or the right has become the left, and it's just as problematic. So that's my opinion. Like I said, take care or leave it. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.